I unlocked the front door earlier than I had in 20 years of marriage, expecting the house to greet me the way it always did, familiar, half asleep. Instead, the silence felt alert, like it had been waiting. The kettle on the stove was cold. The afternoon tea my wife brewed every day sat untouched, its steam long gone, the room holding a faint, confused smell of leaves and regret. She stood near the window, hands folded too tightly, eyes darting when she heard my footsteps. For a moment, she didn't speak. When she did, her voice was thin, stretched over something fragile. She said my name the way people do when they don't know how to explain what they've seen. I asked what was wrong. She shook her head, not trusting herself with words yet. That's when I noticed the sound, metal clicking softly against plaster. Down the hallway, our daughter stood with a tape measure pulled taut across the living room wall, a notebook tucked under her arm. She looked calm. Focused. Like someone doing work they had rehearsed in their mind long before stepping inside our home. I felt the ground shift without moving. My wife looked afraid. My daughter looked certain. And I stood between them, unsure which emotion belonged in my own chest. I didn't yet know whether I was witnessing a betrayal, or a legacy being prepared without my consent. The only thing I knew was how little I truly understood the child I thought I had raised. I have lived most of my life by clocks and payslips, not dreams. I worked the same job for 38 years, left before sunrise, returned after dusk, and measured success by whether the lights stayed on. My income was never impressive, but it was reliable, and reliability felt like a form of love. I didn't give my family vacations in distant places or furniture that impressed guests. I gave them mornings that arrived on time and evenings that didn't collapse. That rhythm became my promise to them, repeated quietly until it felt permanent even when no one nodded anymore. The house itself carries those years in its bones. Every room was earned slowly, never rushed, each repair postponed until it could be afforded without debt. I painted walls instead of replacing them, fixed hinges instead of doors, learned how to stretch usefulness from what others discarded. Nothing here arrived all at once. This place grew the way our family did, through patience and restraint, shaped more by what we refused to buy than what we brought home. It was never grand, but it was honest shelter, and it never pretended to be anything else for anyone living inside it. Our daughter grew up within those walls, absorbing more than I realized. She was sharp, observant, impatient with limits, always sketching ideas bigger than her bedroom. As she grew older, restlessness settled into her like an unspoken itch. She moved out early, came back briefly, then left again with promises that sounded confident but distant. Phone calls shortened. Visits became rare. I told myself independence was success, even when it felt like absence. I assumed she needed distance from the smallness of our life and that someday she would explain it when the timing felt safer to her than now. My wife carried those silences differently. She worried in private, rearranging concern into chores, folding fear into routine. She spoke often about being needed, about usefulness fading with age, about mothers becoming background figures in their children's lives. I dismissed some of it as anxiety, but I saw how her eyes lingered when our daughter left. She feared not abandonment, but replacement, as if another world had claimed the role she once held. It was a quiet grief she never named out loud, one that lived between questions she stopped asking because answers frightened her more than silence ever could. As for me, I believed nothing extraordinary had ever come from my hands. I wasn't brilliant or bold, just consistent. Yet every day I showed up, fixed what was broken, stayed when leaving would have been easier. I taught values without speeches, through repetition and restraint. Looking back, I see how those ordinary acts accumulated quietly. The years of silence between my daughter and me no longer felt threatening in that hallway, they felt unfinished, like a sentence waiting for its meaning, and I finally understood I was still part of it even if I had doubted that before then. I waited until my wife sat down before asking her to explain. She folded her hands the way she does when bracing herself, then said our daughter had been talking in fragments for weeks. She mentioned plans, structural changes, timelines that sounded official but never complete. When my wife asked what any of it meant, she was told it would make sense later. That word later frightened her more than bad news ever could, because it suggested decisions already moving without us. She admitted she hadn't slept the night before. She kept replaying the same thought, that the house might no longer belong to us in the way it once had. Not legally, she clarified quickly, but emotionally. She feared becoming an inconvenience scheduled around progress. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell her she was reading too much into silence, but the tightness in her voice told me the fear had weight. It had been growing quietly, fed by half-sentences and careful avoidance. I walked down the hallway and asked my daughter what she was doing. I kept my voice level, careful not to sound accusatory. She smiled, the practiced smile she uses when she's trying to buy time. She said she was just preparing, nothing more. Preparing for what? I asked. She paused, then repeated the word as if it explained itself. Preparing. The tape measure clicked back into its case with a finality that felt deliberate. In that moment, something small but sharp lodged itself in me. It wasn't anger. It was the realization that my presence was optional in conversations about the place I had spent my life maintaining. I had always assumed this house was my contribution, my proof of usefulness. Standing there, I felt like a guest waiting for permission to understand what was happening under my own roof. They spoke in terms I didn't recognize, as if the world had advanced while I stayed still. Timelines. Projections. Structural considerations. Words designed to move forward without pausing for those still rooted in older rhythms. I noticed how easily my daughter navigated that language, how confidently she avoided specifics. It was a quiet demonstration of competence that left no space for questions from someone like me. I felt a subtle humiliation I couldn't name out loud. Not because she was capable, but because I wasn't included. Because respect, I realized, isn't only about obedience, it's about invitation. And no one had invited me into this version of the future yet. I wondered if I had mistaken silence for trust all these years, if perhaps I had simply been outpaced without noticing. Still, I chose not to push. Confrontation would have satisfied my pride but not my understanding. I watched instead. I listened to what was said and, more importantly, what wasn't. I decided that whatever was unfolding would reveal itself soon enough, and until then, restraint felt like the only way to remain part of it. I reminded myself that patience had built this house more reliably than force ever could. Every argument I avoided in earlier years had taught me that timing mattered more than volume. If I demanded answers now, I might only harden whatever distance already existed. So I stood aside as measurements continued, noting corners I once repaired and marks I once erased. Each scrape of metal against wall stirred memories I hadn't offered her, lessons I assumed were invisible. I began to suspect that silence was not exclusion but incubation, something forming that required space before explanation. The fear remained, but it softened into attention. I told myself that if change was coming, I would meet it the way I met everything else, by staying present without insisting on control, trusting that understanding, like this house, might arrive slowly, piece by piece, when it was ready to carry weight. I did not know then that watching quietly would demand more courage than speaking. But I sensed that this moment was testing something older than authority. It was asking whether I could allow my role to change without disappearing, and whether faith in my own worth could survive uncertainty without immediate proof from anyone else, including the people I loved. Over the next few days, I learned to listen differently. I paid attention to fragments, to words exchanged without intention of being overheard. My daughter spoke on the phone in measured tones, discussing permits, materials, and clients who sounded like neighbors rather than investors. I heard phrases like accessibility, longevity, and preservation, words that felt gentle compared to the forceful language I had feared. Nothing she said carried the urgency of profit. It carried the patience of repair. Slowly, a picture formed. She had helped start a small firm, modest in size but careful in purpose. They focused on restoring older homes for aging families, places where people wanted to remain without surrendering dignity. These weren't projects meant to impress strangers. They were meant to protect memories. I recognized the philosophy immediately, though I had never known she named it professionally. It sounded uncomfortably familiar. As I watched her work, memories surfaced uninvited. I saw myself years earlier, standing on a ladder, filling cracks instead of replacing walls. I remembered explaining why we fixed what still had life left in it. Structure mattered, I used to say. Permanence wasn't about looking new, it was about holding. I had never framed these moments as lessons. They were simply what needed doing at the time. She never spoke of these things directly. There were no speeches, no credits given. Her silence wasn't secrecy, it was respect for timing. She moved through the house with care, measuring not just walls but possibilities, noting angles I had learned to trust by feel alone. The tape me. Assure extended and retracted, not as a threat, but as acknowledgement. It honored what existed before imagining what could follow. I realized then that she had been working toward this for years, quietly building competence without asking permission to grow. While I worried about distance, she was gathering understanding. While I assumed she had outgrown this place, she was studying how to protect it for people like us. The absence I felt was not neglect. It was preparation. What struck me most was her restraint. She could have announced her success, explained her plans, claimed authority. Instead, she waited. She allowed the work to speak when it was ready, trusting that explanation without evidence would sound like arrogance. That patience mirrored something I recognized too late. It was the same instinct that taught me to prove worth through consistency rather than declaration. As these realizations settled, tension grew quietly. A family meeting was scheduled, framed as an inspection day, casual but deliberate. I sensed that whatever she had been measuring would soon be shared in full. The house felt suspended between past and future, holding its breath. I stood inside that pause, understanding now that nothing had been erased. Something had been preserved, carefully, until all of us were ready to see it together. The meeting was set for a Saturday morning, chosen carefully, as if time itself needed to be respectful. The dining table was cleared of its usual clutter and covered instead with neat stacks of paper, rolled drawings, and a folder thick enough to suggest permanence. My daughter stood at the head of the table, not formally, but deliberately. My wife sat beside me, hands resting flat, her fear quiet but alert, waiting for confirmation or relief. My daughter began without drama. She explained permits first, then plans, speaking plainly, pausing often, as though checking that we were still with her. She unrolled drawings across the table, pointing out wide. Ned doorways, reinforced supports, subtle adjustments designed to extend usefulness rather than change identity. She said the house wasn't being sold. It was being adapted. Carefully. Thoughtfully. For long-term security, accessibility, and shared ownership that would protect us without taking control away from us. She explained the funding last. She had paid for everything herself, drawing from the first real success of her firm. Not an investment, she said, but a return. This was what she chose to do with proof that her work mattered. She spoke about dignity, about staying rooted, about refusing to let aging feel like eviction from relevance. Her voice tightened then, and she admitted she had been afraid we would dismiss the idea before understanding it. Afraid that explanation without evidence would sound like arrogance. I surprised myself by answering before thinking. I told her I had been afraid too. Afraid that the house, and my place within it, was no longer needed. Afraid that decisions were being made that had no room for the man who fixed the walls she now measured. The words came slowly, heavy but honest. I admitted the fear of being replaced, not by her success, but by my own obsolescence. She looked at me then, really looked, and shook her head. She said none of this existed without what I taught her. Not through lectures, but through practice. Through repairs instead of replacements. Through respect for structure. She said the foundation mattered more than the design, and I had been the foundation whether I claimed it or not. The room grew still, not with tension, but with recognition. In that moment, something reversed quietly. I saw myself not as outdated, but as essential. Not the obstacle to progress, but its origin. The house around us felt different, not threatened, but affirmed. The walls had listened longer than any of us and now reflected the truth back gently. No one apologized. No one needed to. Silence settled, not heavy, but complete. It's aired understanding instead of regret, and for the first time since I came home early that day, the house felt entirely ours again, past and future holding each other without resistance, ready to move forward together. Relief arrived first, quietly, the way real emotions do when they no longer need to defend themselves. My wife's shoulders lowered as if she had been carrying a weight she never admitted aloud. Her questions softened into observations, her worry easing into something like trust. She moved through the kitchen afterward with a lighter step, touching familiar surfaces as if greeting them again. Fear had not been foolish, it had simply been uninformed, and now it had nowhere left to stay. For me, the feeling was slower and deeper. I realized how often being underestimated had protected me from arrogance. There is a strange safety in being overlooked. No one expects speeches from you, or proof, or constant reinvention. You are allowed to remain steady. I saw that my quiet way of living had given me space to grow roots instead of a spotlight, and those roots had held longer than I ever knew. Pride did not swell in me. It settled. My daughter lingered after the papers were put away. She asked, gently, if we were comfortable with the changes, if we agreed with the pace, if our names felt right on the documents she had prepared. It struck me then that permission was what she had been waiting for all along. Not legal approval, but emotional consent. By asking now, she restored balance without surrendering purpose, acknowledging that respect runs in both directions or not at all. There was satisfaction in that moment, but no urge to display it. I didn't need anyone else to witness it to know it was real. This was victory without triumph, pride without dominance. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. I felt seen, not elevated, and that distinction mattered more than I had ever admitted. In the days that followed, conversation returned. To ordinary things. Meals, weather, small repairs that suddenly felt collaborative instead of solitary. Time passed gently, carrying the changes with it instead of pressing against them. The house adjusted, and so did we, allowing understanding to settle into routine, where it could live without explanation. Nothing felt rushed after that. Change arrived the way weather does, noticeable only when you stop to measure it. My wife laughed more easily, no longer scanning the future for loss. My daughter stayed longer during visits, no longer guarding her purpose like a secret. As for me, I learned that dignity does not demand recognition, it endures quietly until it is acknowledged naturally. The work continued, walls adjusted, schedules discussed, but without urgency. We were no longer bracing for something to be taken. We were participating in something being shared. That realization allowed me to rest inside my own life, not as a caretaker waiting to be replaced, but as a presence still contributing. Whatever came next would arrive with conversation, not surprise, and that certainty softened every remaining edge I hadn't known was still sharp. It taught me patience survives change better than fear ever could alone. The renovations finished without ceremony. No ribbon, no announcement, just rooms settling into their new shapes as if they had always been waiting. Wider doorways didn't erase memories, they made space for them. Light moved more easily through the house, touching corners I once had to reach by effort alone. Nothing felt replaced. Everything felt considered. I lived inside adjustments shaped by respect, not pity, and that difference mattered more than comfort ever could. Daily life resumed, but it carried a new ease. I no longer felt the need to defend my usefulness, and my daughter no longer guarded her independence like a fragile achievement. We spoke openly now, about plans and limits, about what help meant and what it didn't. Recognition moved both ways, unforced. She saw the value of staying rooted. I saw the courage it took to grow beyond those roots without cutting them. There were mornings I noticed small things differently. A handrail warm from sunlight. A doorway that no longer required thought. These were not symbols of decline, but acknowledgments of time. They told me the future had been invited in gently, without asking the past to leave. Permanence felt earned, not imposed. The house became a quiet record of intention. Each change told a story of continuity rather than conquest. I understood then that legacy isn't about what gets passed down intact. It's about what gets carried forward with care. The habits I thought were INV. Isabel had become a language she translated into her own work. What I fixed out of necessity, she preserved out of principle. The distance I once feared had only been space for interpretation. Age no longer felt like a narrowing corridor. It felt like a room finally furnished for honesty. My wife moved through the house without scanning for loss, secure in the knowledge that being needed doesn't always mean being central. Sometimes it means being trusted. Our daughter visited often, not out of obligation, but alignment. We shared meals without explanations, plans without secrecy, and silence without discomfort. Looking around, I realized the house had learned our names. It knew who built it slowly, who worried over it, and who chose to protect it when she could have walked away. That understanding brought a peace deeper than pride. Some people measure success in square footage. I measure it in the moments my children didn't forget where they came from.